Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
I knew something was off the second I opened the envelope. Not because it was written on that fancy cream-colored cardstock my mom only used for church events and funerals, and not even because it had the tacky golden embossing that screamed, "Look how sophisticated I think I am." No, it was the wording. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the 75th birthday of our beloved Margaret Elaine Russell." Our beloved? She wrote it herself, and I knew it. No one else referred to her that way except maybe her reflection. And sure enough, in small cursive at the bottom, she'd signed, "Looking forward to seeing you, Heather. It's been too long. Mother." Not mom. Not love mom. Just mother, like some cold matriarch in a Victorian novel who keeps a ledger of moral failings instead of a scrapbook. It had been 3 years since I'd last seen her in person, and even that visit had ended with her passive-aggressively handing me a self-help book titled Emotional Intelligence for Difficult Adults, with a smirk like she'd just handed me my diagnosis. I'd left early, drove to a gas station, and cried behind the wheel while pretending to check my oil. That's the kind of woman she is. Never outright cruel, never openly hostile, just the kind that can slice you open with a smile and ask you to clean up the mess yourself. And yet, I stared at the invitation longer than I should have. There's something about mothers that does that to you, no matter how many times they've made you feel like an afterthought. A part of me, the foolish, leftover teenager part, still hoped maybe this time would be different. Maybe 75 had softened her. Maybe she finally realized birthdays weren't a stage to humiliate her children on, but a chance to reconnect. But the older, wiser, and honestly more jaded part of me knew better. I could already feel the tension in my stomach before I even RSVP'd. And I did RSVP. Not because I wanted reconciliation, or because I held out hope for some heartfelt toast that ended in teary-eyed hugs, but because I had a plan. And that plan had taken nearly 8 months to execute. It involved real estate agents, a bit of sleuthing, and more patience than I ever knew I had. And I wasn't going to waste it. You see, my mom had always been obsessed with her childhood home, a modest 2-bedroom Victorian in a town called Mount Ivy, about an hour outside the city. She talked about that house like it was some lost temple. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, she'd bring it up. The creaky stairs, the clawfoot tub, the whitewashed porch swing where her mother supposedly used to braid her hair while humming hymns. I say supposedly because my grandmother, rest her soul, never struck me as the maternal type either. But according to Mom, that house was the last place she felt truly happy. Before marriage, before Dad drank himself into silence, before I was born and ruined her figure, as she used to joke, only half joking. So when Jake, my older brother, casually mentioned on a rare sibling phone call that the old house had gone up for sale, and that Mom had been heartbroken about not having the money to buy it, something inside me clicked. And it wasn't bitterness, not exactly. It was clarity. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about control, about rewriting a story that had always been written for me, in her handwriting, with no room for edits. I made some calls, drove out there on a rainy Tuesday, walked through the dusty hallways, and imagined her as a little girl, running barefoot on these hardwood floors, before she became the woman who saw sentimentality as weakness and apologies as negotiations. I bought it in cash, quietly, legally, no public records that would tip her off. And I waited, now standing in my too-clean kitchen with that stupid invitation in one hand and my coffee mug in the other. I realized I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I picked out a dress she'd hate, black with a high slit, the kind she used to call cheap cocktail wear, and heels that made me taller than Jake, which always irked her. I even wore red lipstick, though I hadn't in years, just to twist the knife a little deeper. The day of the party arrived humid and sticky, as if even the weather knew something ugly was brewing beneath the surface. The venue was one of those faux rustic banquet halls with reclaimed wood and overpriced flower arrangements, where people pretend they're having a casual gathering but drop $3,000 on cheese plates. I walked in fashionably 10 minutes late because if I'd learned anything from her, it was that control begins with timing. The room went silent for half a second when I walked in, just enough to let me know that my name had come up before I did. Jake waved, sheepishly, and I made a mental note to corner him later. Her friends, a flock of overdressed women who smelled like lavender and judgment, gave me the once-over. And there she was, Margaret Elaine Russell, sitting on her makeshift throne of pink satin and pearls, sipping champagne like she was the queen of something that mattered. She didn't stand up, just raised an eyebrow and said, "Heather, I wasn't sure you'd come." And I smiled, the kind of smile that feels like armor. "Oh, I wouldn't have missed it for the world," I said, and I meant it. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the celebration she thought she'd choreographed so carefully was about to take a turn, one that started long before the cake was cut, one that began the moment she decided to raise a daughter she never thought would stand up taller than her. And I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The moment I stepped further into that banquet hall, I could feel the temperature drop, not in degrees, but in mood, like I dragged in a cold front with me that swept across the tables of perfectly curated guests, freezing their small talk and polite chuckles into tight-lipped stares and narrowed eyes. The music didn't stop, the servers didn't falter, and the decorative lanterns still glowed in their carefully strung arrangement above the dessert table. But all of that felt like background noise to the real performance, a slow, simmering showcase of who belonged and who clearly did not. And in my mother's world, belonging wasn't about blood or history or pain shared across decades. It was about compliance, obedience, and above all, applause. Jake saw me first, my brother, the ever-golden child, the perfectly sanded down, well-dressed symbol of everything my mother held up as proof that she wasn't, in fact, a failure as a parent. He wore that smug business-casual uniform he always did, tailored navy blazer, pastel button-down, no tie because he liked to pretend he was laid back, even though he couldn't relax if his life depended on it. He gave me a quick, almost apologetic wave, like the kind you'd give to an old classmate you used to mock, but didn't have the nerve to acknowledge properly now. I offered a nod, nothing more. We'd been polite strangers for years, orbiting each other in the family space, without ever colliding, both knowing that if we ever really talked, the whole house of cards might finally collapse. I scanned the room quickly and found my name, not on the family table, not beside my brother or any familiar face, but on a lone white card placed discreetly at the corner of a table near the back, next to a woman I didn't recognize, and a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. My place. The literal corner seat. No flowers, no place settings matching the others. No attention drawn to it at all. Just a subtle, almost invisible message from my mother. "You're here, but only technically." I sat without fanfare, smoothing out my dress and taking a deep breath that tasted like lemon water and restraint. My mother hadn't looked directly at me once since I walked in, which didn't surprise me. Her game had always been silence as punishment, attention as reward, and tonight she was making sure I knew which currency I had been cut off from. The room buzzed with gentle laughter, plates clinking, and those fake polite chuckles people use when they don't want to ask questions but can't stop wondering. I watched as my mother held court from her oversized, ribbon-draped chair, sipping from her champagne glass with the grace of someone who had practiced this moment in the mirror a dozen times. Her hair was styled to perfection, makeup thick enough to smooth out the lines time had carved, and her dress, deep lavender with sequins at the collar, clung to the illusion that 75 was just a number and not a whole history. Jake made a toast early in the evening, his voice soft and performative, full of stories about strength and resilience and how their mother had sacrificed so much for them growing up. I barely resisted the urge to roll my eyes. The way he spoke, you'd think she raised us single-handedly in a shack by the railroad, not in a 4-bedroom home with 2 cars and a father who, while distant, at least kept the lights on. But that was the thing with Jake. He knew how to polish reality until it looked like something people would clap for, and clap they did. I clapped too, slow and measured, watching my mother beam with pride, and it hit me harder than expected. Not the speech, but the way she looked at him, that warmth, that light in her eyes, the easy affection. I couldn't remember the last time she looked at me like that, or if she ever had. Dessert came and went, a towering cake with delicate sugar flowers that looked too expensive to eat. I didn't touch mine. Instead, I sipped my water, counting the seconds, waiting, because I knew something was coming. I didn't know what shape it would take, what mask it would wear, but I could feel it rising in the room like pressure before a storm. And then it happened. Quiet, deliberate, cruel. My mother tapped her glass with the back of a spoon and stood up slowly, like a queen preparing to deliver a decree. Her smile was wide and plastic, and her eyes swept over the room like a spotlight. "I just want to take a moment," she began, voice carrying effortlessly across the space, "to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight to celebrate 75 blessed years of life. I am so lucky to be surrounded by such love." She paused, letting the silence hang, baiting the audience. "Family is everything," she continued, and I knew it was coming now, which is why I've made a very personal decision recently that I'd like to share. It's important to be honest about our choices, and I believe in transparency. The air in the room shifted. You could feel it, like a collective breath being held. I sat perfectly still, my pulse low, my expression calm. She looked directly at me for the first time that night, and in that moment, the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "After much thought, prayer, and consideration," she said, "I've decided to update my will. Effective immediately, my estate will be passed solely to my son, Jake." A few gasps, a few awkward coughs. She kept going. "It's not a decision I made lightly, but one I feel reflects the values and contributions of those closest to me." She didn't look away. She wanted to see the reaction, the hit. Her friends glanced my way, some with sympathy, others with thinly veiled smugness, and Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not expecting the announcement to be so public. I tilted my head slightly, raised my glass, and smiled. Not wide, not sarcastic, just enough to register. "Interesting timing," I said softly, just loud enough for the nearby table to hear. My mother blinked, unsure. The attention was no longer hers alone, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't come here for cake or forgiveness or her approval. I came here with a surprise of my own, something that would unravel everything she thought she controlled. But I wasn't going to tell her just yet. Let her sit in the warmth of her cruel little victory a few moments longer. After all, I had waited almost 4 decades for mine. I could wait a few more minutes. There are moments in life when everything slows down, not in the way people describe during a car accident or some near-death experience, but in a quieter, more internal sense, like the air thickens and time becomes syrup, stretching across your skin and nerves in slow, calculated drips. That was what it felt like, sitting at the corner of that absurdly decorated banquet room, watching my mother, Margaret Elaine Russell, beam like a stage actress delivering the final lines of her monologue, believing herself to be both magnanimous and justified. A woman making tough decisions for the greater good of her legacy. And even though every nerve in my body wanted to recoil, to shake, to cry or shout or even laugh at the absurdity of it all, I didn't flinch, because I had walked into this room not as the victim of her narrative, but as the author of my own. The murmurs rippled softly through the crowd like wind through tall grass, whispers full of half-formed judgments, assumptions hastily built upon years of gossip, stories twisted by distance and favoritism, tales of the difficult daughter and the dutiful son. I could see it in their eyes, the subtle tilt of heads and the way fingers gripped the stems of wine glasses a little tighter, a quiet collective decision being made about who was right and who was wrong, who deserved sympathy and who had simply gotten what they had coming. And yet, beneath that thick layer of social nicety and aging Southern charm, I could also see curiosity, raw, almost greedy curiosity, because people like that live for drama as long as they're not the ones bleeding. Jake looked like he wanted to sink into his chair, not out of guilt or discomfort with inheriting everything, but because even he knew this wasn't how you handled family matters, at least not in front of 40 people with shrimp cocktails and their own unresolved mother issues. He gave me that look he'd perfected over the years, a mixture of pity and avoidance, the kind you offer to someone you've wronged but can't admit it to. Because doing so would mean rewriting your own story as the villain, and Jake never liked playing that role. My eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and I saw something flicker there. Not regret exactly, but awareness, like he'd realized that something was about to shift, and not in his favor. My mother, on the other hand, stood tall and unbothered, as if delivering this bombshell in front of her hand-picked audience was some kind of moral obligation rather than a personal attack thinly veiled as estate planning. She smiled again, God, that smile, and took a sip of champagne as though she'd just donated to charity or rescued a kitten. Her victory was public, intentional, and rehearsed. She wanted applause. What she got was silence. I cleared my throat gently, set my napkin down beside my untouched dessert, and stood up slowly, making sure every inch of my posture radiated calm confidence rather than rage, because I knew that was the one thing she couldn't stand, to be defied with grace instead of drama. The room's attention, which had started to drift back toward their drinks and murmurs, snapped again to me, as though the play had just introduced its unexpected final act. I didn't raise my voice, didn't clink a glass or demand attention. I simply spoke, measured and steady, and let the words carry themselves. Well, I began, locking eyes with my mother as her smile faltered for the first time that night. That's fine. The room froze. A few people glanced nervously at each other, waiting for the punchline, the collapse, the outburst they'd been trained to expect from a daughter like me. Because I wasn't here for the will, I continued, taking a step toward the center of the room, and I wasn't here to beg for something that was never mine to begin with. I saw her hand tighten around her glass, the stem straining under her grip, and for a flicker of a second, I almost felt sorry for her, but only almost. Because I knew what was coming next, and I needed her to hear it without interruption, without distraction, without any way to spin it into something smaller than it was. I was actually here, I said, pausing just long enough to let the room lean in, to let you know that I recently made a little purchase. I turned slightly, letting my voice project toward the people who had once whispered behind my back at church potlucks and PTA meetings. You all remember the house Margaret grew up in? The one she's told stories about since we were kids? The one she said was the last place she ever truly felt happy? She stiffened. Her eyes, already wide, now narrowed slightly. Not fear, not yet, but suspicion. Well, I said, keeping my tone casual, almost conversational. I bought it, closed on it 2 weeks ago. It's mine now. I've been renovating it for a while, actually. Did it quietly, out of respect. But now that we're being transparent about legacies and decisions, I thought it was the right moment to share. You could have heard a pin drop. And in that drop, in that sacred stillness of realization, I watched my mother's entire facade waver. Her fork, midair, halfway to a bite of raspberry torte, stopped. Just froze there, her fingers slightly trembling. That was the moment. That was the shift. Not the inheritance, not the will, not the public announcement of rejection, but the knowledge that the one thing she treasured, the place she clung to as her sacred origin story, now belonged to the daughter she had spent a lifetime trying to diminish. I smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough to let her know this wasn't about revenge in the way she understood it. This was about reclaiming space. And for the first time, I felt taller than her, not because of heels or posture, but because I had taken something back that she couldn't spin, couldn't twist, couldn't undo. The guests sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or pretend nothing had happened. Jake stood abruptly and walked toward the exit without a word, his face flushed and unreadable. My mother didn't move, just sat there, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, the raspberry torte melting slowly on her untouched plate. And I, still standing in that absurd banquet hall with its soft lighting and overpriced linens, felt more grounded than I had in years. Because the will, the money, the family show, those were her weapons, but I had found my own, and I hadn't even begun to use it yet. There is a certain silence that follows a blow too heavy for words, a silence not of peace but of shock, thick with the weight of something irreversible, something real that cannot be laughed off or denied or tucked away under a neat, rehearsed smile. That was the silence that filled the banquet hall after I dropped my quiet little announcement like a match into a room full of dry curtains. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time, as though the very molecules in the air were holding their breath alongside everyone else, waiting for Margaret Elaine Russell, queen of controlled chaos, master of social posturing, to make her next move, to reclaim her stage, to sweep the narrative back under her feet like she always did. But she didn't move. She just sat there, fork still raised, her lipstick starting to crack at the edges, her eyes fixed on me not with fury, not with disbelief, but with something far more satisfying, confusion laced with dread. And that look, that brief fracture in her mask, was worth every hour of planning, every dollar spent, every memory I had to choke down in order to walk through that house and make it mine. I had not just bought a property, I had bought her mythology, the holy ground of her ego, the place she returned to again and again in her stories, not because it was truly perfect, but because it allowed her to erase everything that came after, her bitterness, her disappointments, her mistakes as a mother. That house had become her Eden, and in her mind, it still belonged to her even if someone else paid the taxes. She never thought I would dare touch it, let alone claim it. What none of those guests knew, what even Jake barely understood, was that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a petty act of revenge born from a bruised ego. This had been a quiet war, years in the making, waged in silence and solitude, in therapist offices and long nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why I still cared at all. I hadn't bought the house out of spite. I bought it because I needed to see who I was when I wasn't under her roof, under her thumb, under her idea of who I was supposed to be. And maybe, deep down, I wanted to find out if the version of her she told us about, the innocent girl on the porch swing, the sweet daughter of the town baker, was ever real at all. I had spent the past 6 weeks visiting the house every weekend, walking through rooms that smelled of mildew and old paint, brushing my hands against the faded wallpaper she used to describe in such detail, rosebuds and lattice in the upstairs hallway, a soft robin's egg blue in the kitchen, and I had tried to picture her there, not as the woman who had cut me out of her will, but as the child she claimed to have been, wide-eyed and full of dreams. And the strangest part was, I could see her curled on the windowsill in the bedroom facing the street. Writing in a journal or braiding her doll's hair, I could imagine the scent of bread from the downstairs oven, the faint laughter of siblings long dead. But instead of resentment, I felt something colder, something more detached. That child had nothing to do with me. That girl was just another part of a story I was never meant to be in. After I made my announcement and the silence stretched on, longer than anyone could tolerate, I picked up my clutch, offered a final nod to the room, more out of social obligation than anything else, and walked out without looking back. I didn't need to see her reaction, didn't need to watch her scramble for control, because I had already won. Not the way she would define it, not in terms of inheritance or public favor, but in the quiet, devastating way of someone who refuses to play the same broken game. Outside, the parking lot was bathed in gold from the setting sun, the kind of warm light that makes everything look softer, like the world's trying to apologize for being so cruel. I sat in my car for a few minutes, staring at the dashboard, my hands steady for once. That was the real surprise, that I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated or even angry. I just felt still. For the first time in years, maybe longer, there was no weight pressing down on my chest, no voice in my head asking me what I'd done wrong, It was quiet, and that silence, unlike the one in the banquet hall, was welcome. Later that night, just as I was pouring myself a glass of red wine and settling onto the couch in my apartment, my phone buzzed. Caller ID Mom. Not Mother, not Margaret, just Mom. The name I hadn't changed since I was 16, too stubborn to delete it even after a dozen silent treatments and 100 cold shoulders. I let it ring twice before answering. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. You had no right, she said, voice low, controlled, like she was trying not to let the rage slip through the cracks. You think buying that house makes you something special. I sipped my wine, leaned back into the couch cushions, and said nothing. It was my childhood, she hissed. You don't know anything about it. You don't know what that place meant. Oh, I know exactly what it meant, I replied calmly, and now it means something else. It means you don't get to rewrite everything anymore. It means I get to walk through your stories and see what's real and what was just another part of your script. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear her breathing, sharp and uneven. You're trying to hurt me, she finally said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. No, I said, and I meant it. I'm trying to find something that doesn't belong to you. She hung up without another word. I didn't call back. And the next morning, I drove to the house again. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, and I stood in that upstairs hallway with the rosebud wallpaper, staring at the sunlight spilling through the cracked window. I didn't feel like an intruder. I didn't feel like a thief. I felt like someone who had returned, not to a home, but to a battlefield, and realized the war was already over. There's a strange kind of peace that arrives not when everything is resolved, not when justice has been served in some dramatic courtroom way, but when you finally accept that the person you wanted the most from, whether it be love, apology, or even just the basic decency of truth, will never, not in this lifetime, be capable of giving it. And so instead of waiting, you simply stop. Not out of bitterness, not out of surrender, but because you realize that continuing to need something from them is like screaming into a canyon and expecting it to answer in a different voice than your own echo. That was what I felt, standing inside the old house that used to live only in my mother's romanticized stories, now stripped of its legends, its ghosts, its weaponized nostalgia. The walls no longer whispered her childhood back at me. They just stood there, faded and cracked, and waiting for something new to begin. And in that quiet, echoing house, I understood that I hadn't come looking for her history. I had come to bury it. It had been 4 days since the party, 4 days since I'd stood in that chandelier-lit banquet hall and watched my mother's power crumble beneath the weight of her own myth. I hadn't heard from her since the phone call, and honestly, I hadn't expected to. She never called twice, not unless she had a fresh strategy to unroll. But it was Jake who broke the silence, as he always did, stepping in with that practiced, half-guilty voice of his, the same one he used as a kid when he told on me for things we both did. He called from his office, his voice low, like he didn't want to be overheard. She's not doing well, he said, as if that were news. She hasn't left the house. She told Marlene from church that you buying the place was like digging up her grave. I didn't say anything at first. I let the words hang there because I needed him to feel them land. Jake, for all his charm and surface-level empathy, had spent his life as her shield, her buffer, her golden child, who got the best of her while I spent years clawing for crumbs. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to feel that imbalance, that slow, gut-sick realization that playing her favorite had cost him something too, like truth or clarity, or maybe even his own backbone. I didn't buy the house to spite her, I finally said, and I meant it. I bought it because I needed to know if she was telling the truth, about who she was, about what mattered to her. And guess what? She was lying to herself, just like she lied to us. He sighed, long and heavy, the sound of a man caught between loyalty and understanding, between the mother who raised him and the sister he never really tried to know. So what now? He asked. What's your plan? I almost laughed. A plan? As if this was a chessboard and I had some final, glorious move to make. As if any of this ended in a checkmate. "There's no plan," I said. She gave her final performance. I just refused to clap. We didn't speak again after that. Not that day, and not the next. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix it. I didn't send a follow-up text. I didn't lie awake worrying if I'd gone too far. Instead, I got up early, drove to Mount Hawk Ivy with a bag of tools, and spent the morning scraping old paint off a bedroom window frame. The one that faced the street. The one my mother claimed she used to stare out of every morning while dreaming about a life she never quite reached. I stood there for a long time, brush in hand, the breeze curling through the open pane, and I wondered if maybe, in that moment, I was living the life she had once wanted. Not because of the money, not because of the house, but because I was alone and calm and not pretending anymore. That afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and threw soft amber light across the worn floorboards, I heard the crunch of gravel, a car door, footsteps. I knew it was her before I turned around, not because of intuition or some maternal tether, but because there was a tension in the air that only she could carry, like a storm with its own gravity. She stood in the doorway, wearing a pale cardigan and the same pearls she always wore to funerals. Her makeup was less precise, her hair slightly unkempt, and for a moment she looked smaller than I remembered. Not old necessarily, but deflated, like a person whose armor had been removed without permission. "This is trespassing," she said flatly, though there was no force behind it. No venom, just ritual. I put down the scraper, wiped my hands on my jeans, and met her gaze. "It's not," I replied. "I own it. You're the one on my property." She flinched, just slightly, but held her ground. "You've made your point." "No," I said, stepping closer, not to intimidate but to be heard, truly heard for once. "You don't get to decide when the point ends. You made your choices. You raised 2 kids and convinced one of them she was broken, and the other that he was golden. And now you're shocked that the golden one can't carry your weight, and the broken one doesn't want to." Her eyes glistened, but whether it was grief or fury or just the cold air, I couldn't tell. "I came here," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper, "because I wanted to see if you were gloating." I smiled then, but it wasn't cruel or smug or triumphant. It was the kind of smile that comes when you've crossed a finish line alone and realize there's no one there to hand you a trophy. And that's okay. "I'm not," I said. "That smile, it's not about money, it's not about the house. It's about being done." She didn't reply, just stood there, breathing unevenly, eyes scanning the walls as if trying to pull memories from the wood. And then, without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. I didn't watch her drive away. Instead, I returned to the window frame, picked up the scraper again, and went back to work. Because sometimes revenge isn't about destruction or confrontation or winning in front of a crowd. Sometimes it's about quietly choosing yourself, choosing peace, choosing not to carry a war any longer. And in that house, her house, my house, there were still rooms to reclaim. Not for her, not for the past, but for whatever came next.